Good afternoon and welcome to the State of School Climate, a federal briefing hosted by the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color and the Communities for Just Schools Fund. My name is Jamie Coppell. I'm with the Communities for Just Schools Fund. I'm going to run through a few quick logistics to ensure the webinar runs smoothly, and then I'm going to hand it off to my co-host Damon Hewitt to welcome you officially. A few quick things to know about Zoom. You're able to control your sound and video in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You'll also see there that there is a Q&A box that you can use at any point throughout the briefing to share questions with us that we will make certain to direct to the panelists as appropriate. We also encourage you to use the chat box to share information and ideas with us and with other participants. We'll be sure to not only share the recording of this briefing, but we will also share that chat box as a resource. So if there's something that your foundation has created or your organization would like to make available to people, we encourage you to drop a link into the chat box so that we can save that information. Note that we will pause after our first two speakers for a brief Q&A, and that will be a good chance for us to look to the chat and to the Q&A to see what questions you've already put in there, and we'll also take questions in that moment. And then we'll pause again after the second two speakers. So without further ado, I am delighted to hand it over to my co-host, Damon Hewitt, to welcome us for this afternoon session.
Thanks so much, Jamie, and good afternoon to some and good morning to others. We're really pleased to bring this discussion to you today, and we do want it to be a discussion. We hope that everybody who's connected gets involved. You can just listen, but also getting involved is the way that we can really start to develop some shared understanding, shared strategies, and move those into action, which is so important. I want to give a quick overview about the Executives Alliance for those who may not be familiar, but then talk about a little bit of context for today's discussion. First, Executives Alliance, as some of you know, is a philanthropic network comprised of about 40 foundations, all of whom have varying investments, some in health equity, some focused on education, some focused on justice reform, criminal, juvenile justice. But what they all have in common is that there's a belief that, number one, we're not going to make the changes we want to see for boys and men of color and their families and communities through individual interventions alone. We have to address the policies, systems, and structures, frankly, that set the environmental context that lead to negative outcomes, that lead to lack of opportunity, and that frankly lead to oppression. And so they're committed to doing that and exploring better ways to do that every day. They also understand that just like no one nonprofit organization can change the world alone, no one foundation can either. And so foundations are figuring out ways to come together through joint investments, through aligned investments, and through their leadership to make a difference. Now, this moment in time tells us that a group like the Executives Alliance, like Communities for Just Schools Fund, and all of our allies are more needed. Our work is more needed now than ever before. The kind of threats that we're all facing, that multiple communities are facing, that are marginalized across the spectrum, seem to just defy all reality and logic, especially over the last year and a half, whether it be in terms of educational opportunity, whether it be in terms of police interaction with communities of color, especially young people who are overly criminalized, hurt, harmed, and sometimes killed, whether it be with respect to economic opportunity or even immigration issues and even gender equity issues. All of these issues have sparked movements, some of rather recent vintage, but movements that we believe at their core are very much interconnected. And part of our role for our organizations is to make sure we can help funders see those connections, and not just in a rhetorical sense, but also to leverage those connections for mutual support so that the sum is greater than the total, right? So what we want to do is use this opportunity to talk about what are these threats that are being faced and what are folks doing about it in communities, and how does that community voice make its way up to the national or federal level. This is a really big opportunity moment for us because we know that both grassroots organizations, grass tops, and funders did so much during the Obama years. But those were the years of plenty. We were in the land of plenty then. Now things are different. Those of us who were used to going to meetings with the prior administration, we're not doing that, most of us, so much now. Now, of course, part of that is strategic, but also the question is, what push can we make now? How can we leverage dollars, private, public dollars, even corporate dollars? How can we leverage the leadership? How can we call people out when needed, but also call people in? And how can we leverage, from our perspective, the leadership of foundation presidents and CEOs and senior staff to do more than write a check and walk away, to actually have some skin in the game, some stake, to use their reputational capital to make a difference? Because what we're really talking about is not just some far off set of kids. We're talking about our kids, my children, your children, that we literally have or that we actually care about. So the stakes are really high. I'm so glad to be in this work with amazing partners. I want to recognize a few before I turn it back to Jamie. First, Dan Werner from the Arcus Foundation and Castle Redmond from the California Endowment, who are the co-conveners of the Executive Alliance's table on school discipline and climate and healthy climate. You all are doing such important work in your foundations, in the communities you serve, and also as leaders in our philanthropic network and beyond. So I appreciate you. I also want to recognize Morgan Shannon, who's the program manager for the Executives Alliance, who for years has coordinated this table and has helped build it to where it is today. Couldn't be here without you to take advantage of this moment of opportunity. And then finally, and not last but not least, our partners at Communities for Just Schools Fund, which has quickly become one of the most important organizations supporting grassroots groups and really making those connections to funders, to the grass tops, and to policymakers about why this work is so important. So for Allison Brown, Jamie Coppell, Bomani Johnson, all of your staff and consultants, just really appreciate everything you all do every day for communities. Back to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Damon. It really is a pleasure to be able, as the Communities for Just Schools Fund, to partner with the Executives Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, because what we have consistently seen is that the funders who've been coming together at the table that we helped to convene, the School Discipline and Healthy Climate Table, these are folks who've been at the vanguard of advancing positive school climate reforms since the very beginning. And so to be able to continue in partnership in ways that are so directed towards the needs of boys and young men of color and towards improving and ending racial disparities in school discipline at a moment, as Damon said so well, where we face all kinds of new threats in addition to the threats we've been fighting for so long. We can't do this alone. And so to be able to do it with such fully invested partners is truly something that gives us great hope that we can accomplish all that we aim to accomplish. I do want to take a moment in the spirit of being the Communities for Just Schools Fund, which is an organization that exists with the explicit emphasis on resourcing grassroots organizers, to just share a very brief clip with all of you as a stark reminder of why we are on this briefing today. I won't repeat what Damon said so well, but we know that in this moment, we hear from a lot of people, well, you know what, the things that are happening at the federal level are so harmful, that's just not where we're gonna work anymore. This week, and Kaitlin will dig deeper into this in a little bit, there was a Federal School Safety Commission listening session. It was advertised at 4:12 p.m. last Friday as something that people could sign up to attend. That is the kind of sign up that is intended to ensure that the only people who can access a listening session are those with the political and financial capital to fly to Washington, D.C. if they're not here already on a dime. We were able to rally the troops, if you will, and bring an amazing team of organizers from around the country to speak to the needs and speak from the voices of youth and family parent organizers who know what they want and what it's going to take to create a positive school climate in their communities. And I want to share with you a clip from Congressman John Rutherford, who was one of the architects of the Stop School Violence Act, which you'll also hear about in a little bit. He is a congressman from Florida, and he is also, as he attests at the beginning of the remarks, which I will not share, a former sheriff of decades. And his words, which he does not even hear himself say, are absolutely the imperative that drives all of the remarks you will hear as we move forward in this webinar today. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen. And we're going to go here. And I encourage you to lean in. The audio is only so good, and the words, which are 15 seconds long, are worth hearing.
I think we need to look at why these individuals go back to their school to kill their fellow inmates. Think about that. They don't go.
I'm going to play that for you one more time.
I think we need to look at why these individuals go back to their school to kill their fellow inmates. Think about that. They don't go.
So yes, we need to think about that. We need to think about the fact that one of the architects of an incredibly harmful school discipline bill that was just passed in Congress, a former sheriff, called students in our nation's public schools inmates, had the forethought to say, think about that, but didn't have the presence of mind to realize that he had just called students inmates. As someone who was sitting in the room listening to this man who kicked off a listening session that was a day long this week, nobody knew what to think. And then we realized this is the environment in which we are working, and this is why we are doing this work. And so I think it's the right place to start. And so with that in mind, and without further ado, I am delighted to introduce to all of you the amazing slate of speakers who will be sharing their wisdom with all of us today. There we go. So the first person that we'll hear from, and I'll introduce her in a moment, is Kristen Harper. Kristen is the Director for Policy Development at Child Trends, and I had the pleasure of working with Kristen for years when I was at the Department of Justice, and she was at the Department of Education for 7 years, making great things happen around school discipline. We owe a lot of the successes we saw in previous years to the hard work behind the scenes of Kristen. So I'm delighted she's going to be here to talk with us today about the civil rights data collection and a recent report issued by the GAO here in Washington, D.C. We're also going to hear from Miriam Rollin, another longtime legal advocate, litigator, who is now the director of the Education Civil Rights Alliance, which is, as Miriam will explain to all of you, an important new litigation strategy that has been created to fill the void as federal enforcement becomes a thing of the past. We're next going to hear from Kaitlin Banner, who is the Deputy Program Director for the Ending the Schoolhouse to Jailhouse track at the Advancement Project, an incredibly important field building organization that has been in this since before the very beginning, that is doing community lawyering, that is doing incredibly important communications work, and that is invested in the success of grassroots groups. So we're delighted that Kaitlin is with us to talk about the field of legislative madness of late. And then last, but certainly not least, we will hear from Marlyn Tillman, who wears many hats. First of all, that of being a mother of 2 amazing young men. She is also the co-founder and executive director of Gwinnett Parent Coalition to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, also known as Gwinnett SToPP. And Marlyn also serves and has for quite a long time as a federal liaison to the Dignity in Schools campaign. And she is going to speak with us specifically today about the Every Student Succeeds Act toolkit that the Dignity in Schools campaign has recently created with several partners and allies, including the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and Partners 4, which is a toolkit specifically to resource parents and young people in understanding how to use the Every Student Succeeds Act as a tool in their organizing and advocacy efforts. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kristen, who is going to talk with us about why data is such an important tool in our collective toolkit, and why, after a very long wait, finally we have access to the 2015-16 civil rights data collection, and what that means for what we can do with this information. Kristen, the floor is yours.
Kristen, I think you're muted.
Mute myself. Apologies. I'll start again. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I was asked to provide an overview of where we are as a nation on school climate, with an emphasis on the state of school discipline in this country. And for this discussion, I'll walk through several sources. federal source of information on school climate and give some of the highlights from one of our most powerful sources of information, the Civil Rights Data Collection, and then walk through findings from a recent report on school discipline from our Federal Government Accountability Office. So to start with, you have multiple sources of federal data that help us track indicators of student safety and student behavior. These are the top four. The Civil Rights Data Collection, which we'll spend a lot of time on today, which gathers administrative data from schools on issues beyond school climate, but inclusive of school climate. The School Survey on Crime and Safety, which also gathers administrative data on schools. This one really delves into really important issues of school capacity. What staff are available in schools, how are they trained to address issues of violence and safety, how trained to respond to issues of related to discipline, the different types of security measures schools are using. The next two on the list are a little different. These are both student surveys. Schools don't respond to these. Students give their direct responses. So one is the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey, which mostly focuses on issues of student health, physical activity, dietary behaviors, but it also asks about behaviors that might contribute to injury or violence on school grounds. Did you have a fight in school? Did you bring a weapon to school? Have you ever felt scared to go to school? We also have data from the School Crime Supplement to the National Crime Victimization Survey. It's a biennial data collection, though I think 2017 might have been skipped. This one asks really fine-grained questions about school experiences. Have you experienced bullying or cyberbullying? Was the bullying related to any individual characteristics? And it also asks questions about school participation, relationships with teachers, presence of gangs. Across these four data collections, only the Civil Rights Data Collection is gathered from every school and school district. The rest use sampling procedures that are really designed for either state or national statistics. So the Civil Rights Data Collection amongst these is unique. And for those, that want, a one-stop shop for where do you get data from all four of these indicators and their implications for climate, the U.S. Department of Education publishes every year this booklet on indicators of school crime and safety. Now, I'll be honest, today's conversation is about school climate, and the indicators that are generally pulled for this book really don't cover the full range of issues that we want to think about when we're talking about school climate. So it's very weak focus on issues like of interpersonal relationships or respect for diversity. They don't capture issues of the physical environment. There's a very heavy focus on issues of discipline and physical safety, with some light touches on substance use, very light touches on school participation, and just want to make sure people are aware of that. But still a very rich source of data, and it's updated every single year.
Kristen, we are enjoying your presentation, but we are seeing your notes screen. If there's a way you can minimize one so that we can see your full beautiful images, that would be great.
Is that better? Or are you still seeing my note screen?
No, I think we're good now.
Good now? Okay, wonderful. The Civil Rights Data Collection, to start our deep dive, again, is unique amongst the data collections. It is universal. It contains data from every public school and every public school district in the nation. It's biennial, so if you want universal data, you have it as far back as 2000. As far back as the 11-12 school year, and then of course the 13-14, and then the 15-16. If you try to go back beyond the 11-12 school year, you only have data available from the 7,000 largest school districts in the nation. Still very, very helpful, but not every single school and school district is in there. And then the school climate indicators in the collection can be disaggregated, even cross-tabulated by race, gender, disability status. So again, very, very rich source of collection. And what's amazing about it is how accessible this data is to communities. Communities can search for their school or school district on the at the website I've listed here. You just put in the name of your school or your school district, and it'll pull up all these rich pieces of information for you. So just to give you a sense of what the different kinds of data related to school climate are in the Civil Rights Data Collection, I think they fall into sort of three different buckets. One is discipline and responses to school behavior. So your different, forms of suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, referrals to law enforcement, including school-based arrests. And while we never want to think of seclusion and restraint as a form of discipline, it is absolutely a type of school response to student behavior. New this year is all of this new data on the different kinds of staff available in schools. And this is important so that we understand school capability to address student health and really support educators in addressing student behavior. So we now, in addition to data on counselors, which we've had for a while, we now have new data on school nurses, school psychologists, school social workers. And for the first time, we have really, detailed data about to what extent schools are also using security guards and sworn law enforcement officers in schools. So not just do you have them, do you not, but how many do you have, and just to what extent are they represented in the school. Also, for the first time, is new data on school safety, which was previously collected under a completely different data collection. But again, now we have this data for every school and school district. Are these different aspects of school safety? And I won't go through these, and I won't spend too much time on these in this presentation. It's important to understand that given this is the first year of data collection for all these different school safety indicators, these really should be taken with a grain of salt. So the data's there, you can absolutely look at it, just recognize this is the first time schools were asked to collect it and submit it to the federal government. So we may be seeing some data quality issues, at least in this first year. So a deep dive, and just to be clear, a lot of the pieces I'm pulling for this presentation are straight from a set of data highlights that were published by the U.S. Department of Education this year. So when we talk about school discipline in particular, we tend to focus on out-of-school suspensions. Why? Because it's the most common amongst the different types of discipline, apart from in-school suspensions. But in out-of-school, we're pretty sure that there's an interruption to instruction that the students are experiencing. And so for the 15-16 school year, the most recent year for which we have civil rights data collection information, 2.7 million kids received at least one out-of-school suspension that year. That's about 5 to 6% of all kids. And when we look across different racial ethnic groups, we continue to see, similar to what we saw in past years, wide and persistent disparities by race for Black male and female students. Now, I want to be clear about how you read this graph that I've put up. This is not, you don't read this by looking at your risk of out-of-school suspension. This is not how many Black students versus other racial ethnic groups were removed. This is a comparison of representation in the total enrollment versus amongst students that received at least one out-of-school suspension. So while Black students represent 8% of male student enrollment, they represent 25% of male students that were suspended out of school. And then we're seeing similar, not quite as wide, but still troubling gaps for Black females. Black students, again, represent 8% of Black female enrollment, but 14% of females suspended out of school. Then, just to take another cut, definitely want to make sure we're paying attention to our children with disabilities. We continue to see wide and persistent disparities. The representation of children with disabilities, those served by IDEA, amongst students suspended out of school is twice their representation in total enrollment. Now, one thing, I don't have a pretty graph to show you here, but it's really important that we're cross-tabulating with this kind of data. Historically, male children of color with disabilities have experienced the highest rates of out-of-school suspension. I said earlier, in general, you see risk of out-of-school suspension in any given year for your general population is about 6%. In the 13-14 school year, we know that for children with disabilities, that doubled to about 11-12%. And for male children of color with disabilities, it doubled again to anywhere between 24 and 27%. So definitely want to make sure we're looking at subgroups within subgroups when it comes to out-of-school suspension. And we're seeing that these kind of gaps, persist across different types of discipline. School-related arrests, we're seeing gaps, particularly for our Black students, seclusion and restraint, we're seeing those gaps, and we're also seeing them for expulsions. Much smaller numbers for these types of discipline, but the gaps are still there. Also want to make sure that we're paying attention to, given that we have this, new rich data about school capacity, to what extent are schools deploying school resource officers and security guards, compared with to what extent they're deploying staff that can really address student, health needs, particularly mental health needs. So Child Trends took an initial look at the 15-16 civil rights data collection and really focused on use of school social workers and school psychologists, as well as law enforcement and security guards. And we found that for schools that are serving mostly Black students, such schools, the middle and high schools, are more likely to have school-based security staff than other places. Then we also looked at, are there places where there are actually more security staff than there are, at the school mental health providers? And again, we found that if we break the schools down by racial homogeneity, 20%, over 20% of schools serving mostly Black students had more sworn law enforcement officers and security guards on school grounds than they did staff that could address student mental health. And that's when we're put that in the context of what we're seeing on discipline. This is really very troubling. There seem to be disparities in access to staff that can support students' mental health needs. So jumping from the civil rights data collection, I promised to speak a little bit about a GAO report that came out just this year focusing on discipline. This is a federal agency that audits the performance of government agencies and explores how they are addressing issues of import across the nation. So GAO was asked by Congress to look at patterns in disciplinary actions, which they did mostly by examining the 2013-14 civil rights data collection. They asked to look at challenges that selected school districts reported in their attempts to address student behavior. And for that, they looked at 5 states, California, Georgia, Massachusetts, North Dakota, and Texas. They looked at 1 district within each of those states and multiple schools within each of those districts. Then they did, some examination of the different actions that federal agencies have taken to address disparities or discrimination in school discipline. And what they found with respect to patterns in disciplinary actions is, though they were looking at a different year, they used the 13-14 civil rights data collection. I just showed you the 15-16. It's very sadly similar to what we saw before, though. What GAO really did find is, I think it's best described as a narrative of how our schools are just disciplining Black students very differently from all others, and that pattern of disparity, just persists across schools regardless of the poverty level of the school, the type of school the student attends, or the type of disciplinary action that you look at. So this is a cut of the data that I wasn't able to present with the 15-16, but GAO, did look at, schools at the different poverty levels of schools. And you can see that for schools with, very low poverty, Black students were, overrepresented by 12 percentage points. Again, this is not risk, this is just a comparison of representation in the total enrollment versus representation amongst students suspended. So for your low poverty schools, Black students are overrepresented by 12 percentage points. For your highest disparity, your 75 to 100% poverty, Black students were overrepresented by 24 percentage points. So while there's very clear disparity, no matter what your level of poverty, it does get worse for your highest poverty schools, distressingly. Another cut of the data was type of school. So again, doesn't matter what type of school we see overrepresentation, particularly for Black students, just across the board. But, a couple of them stick out. Your traditional schools are at about 22 percentage points overrepresented. Compare that to your magnet schools, we're at 28%, and charter schools, which are the highest degree of overrepresentation, we're seeing a whopping almost 32 percentage point overrepresentation for Black students. When GAO went to the 5 states to ask, okay, what are the challenges that you are seeing in addressing behavior? These were the different issues that the school districts, spoke of, with very heavy emphasis on challenges addressing trauma and student mental health, in ways in which they, in struggling to find ways that they can address, particularly trauma and mental health. They really were concerned about, the influence of bullying, particularly bullying that was taking place on social media, and just a host of different issues that they were just struggling to find ways to support students in their in their efforts to improve school discipline. There were, in GAO's efforts to figure out the different ways in which school districts were addressing, these challenges, what we saw is your sort of typical, cast of approaches. PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, came up quite a bit in the schools GAO talked to, as did restorative practice and social emotional learning. So those are typically the 3 that we tend to see from schools in their efforts to support students and move away from punitive discipline practices, and basically that's similar to what GAO found. So just as last slide, the GAO just did provide, a helpful overview of, the different federal efforts that, have happened over the last 6-7 years to address, school discipline practice. Of course, we have sort of 2 big pieces of guidance. One on, the non-discrimination on the basis of race in the administration of discipline that was distributed in 2014. There was a 2016 piece of guidance that really focused on children with disabilities, sort of again acknowledging that intersection between race and disability, and making sure that we're including in individualized education programs, services and supports that directly address students' behavior, so that we're not suspending children with disabilities out of school. They walk through different civil rights investigations that took place both in the U.S. Department of Education and Justice. The Department of Education in over several years has supported 2 technical assistance centers where states and districts can seek assistance, one focused on positive behavioral interventions and supports, another one focused very broadly on issues of school climate. And then walk through 3 different grant programs, all discretionary grant programs discretionary competitive grant programs that have supported in recent years, efforts to learn more about what helps keep students safe and helps districts move away from punitive discipline, as well as programming that, as well as just financial support for new programming. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you,
Happy
Kristen.
to take everyone's questions.
That is great. And in the spirit, that was wonderful. You'll see as you take a look at the chat that there's some great questions rolling in. I'll direct all the panelists to take a look there. I'm going to forecast 2 of the questions I see in there for us to discuss after we hear from Miriam. So with that, Kristen, if you unshare your screen, then Miriam will be able to share hers. That's perfect. And Joe, just to say in the forecasting, there's some great questions around how those new data points came to be collected. If one of the panelists, when we get to Q&A, could speak to the advocacy behind the scenes that led to the inclusion of new categories. And then also a wonderfully important question about digging beneath the data points related to who are these mental health providers? What can we actually determine about what needs they're serving, and are they serving the needs of students of color particularly? So we'll come to those questions. But first, we're going to hear from Miriam Rollin, who, as I mentioned, is the director of the Education Civil Rights Alliance. And she's going to share with us the amazing and important work the ECRA is doing to fill the litigation void that exists now that the federal government is not so much in the enforcement game. So Miriam, without further ado, it's all yours. And we're gonna, and Miriam is frozen. We're gonna give it a minute. That happens sometimes. Let's see here. All right, let's give Miriam one more minute. And what we can always do, just to cue it up, is Kaitlin, if we're still having trouble, we'll come around to you and then we'll come back to Miriam.
Sounds great. I'm here and hopefully you can hear me right now. So it's no,
yeah.
We're good to go.
Okay, good. So let's see here. Miriam. Okay, so I think we've lost her. So I'll work on getting Miriam back, but Kaitlin, so hold all of your excitement and enthusiasm for that litigation strategy, everyone. We're gonna first turn to Kaitlin Banner, who has agreed to take on the task of helping us to understand what we're seeing coming out of the executive branch, what we're seeing from Congress, in terms of legislation, and what we're seeing in terms of what is happening across the states in this moment post-Parkland and how that relates to pre-Parkland. So with that, Kaitlin, thank you. We're going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be on the webinar today and chatting with you all and sharing just some of what we're seeing happening at the state and the federal level right now in terms of really challenges and threats and maybe opportunities as well as to what we're seeing with regards to school safety, school discipline, and school climate. We are certainly, I think, in a moment where we're seeing a lot of attention and energy being paid at both the local, state, and federal level to school safety, particularly in light of both the Parkland shootings and then the school shootings that have unfortunately happened and the tragedies that have happened since then. And for those of us who have been working in this field for a long time, we know that the questions around school safety intersect with school climate, but they're distinct conversations, and that we need to be really thoughtful in making sure that when we're engaging in these conversations around what is going to make our schools safer and how do we protect young people and how do we make sure that young people are receiving a high quality education to which they have access, that we're not conflating those two things. And so I'm really excited just to talk about some of the trends that are happening and of course to answer questions afterwards. So I'm just going to move into sharing my screen and give me 1 second. All right, so hopefully you're able to see the screen now. And let me just go through. So I want to start out by just talking about what some of the general trends that we're seeing are across the board. So this, I'm going to dive into some specific examples of this, but I think at sort of all levels right now, from school board policy changes to federal policy changes, we're seeing an increased investment in policing. So we know that schools are making decisions to bring police into schools, that there are local, state, and federal grant money that's being made available for policing in schools. And there's a real emphasis on bringing policing and police officers into schools in the name of school safety. Number two is that we're seeing an increased investment in law enforcement infrastructure. So we're seeing that schools are choosing on their own or because of new policies to invest school budget money, which we know is notoriously underfunded and tight for individual schools, into things like metal detectors, surveillance equipment, fences, video cameras, all sorts of things that really go to sort of what folks refer to as the theater of security. So things that make schools appear to be more secure, but in actuality are maybe not the steps that are going to make schools the most secure. The third trend that we're seeing, particularly alarmingly, is a trend of arming school teachers or school staff. And so an example of this is in Florida, where they passed a law that requires that every school in Florida needs to have either a police officer placed in school, or they need to designate what they're calling a school guardian, which is somebody who is going to be a trained and active shooter response, and who's going to be carrying a gun on school grounds at all times. And of course, this is particularly alarming given what we know about the way that bias operates among our school staff. I think the fourth thing that we see happening right now is the creation of new school-based crimes. And so For a long time, I think as Kristen talked about, and as many of you know, the advocacy community and the young people and grassroots community has fought and won the understanding that young people in schools are engaging in behaviors that should not be considered crimes. And we've been able to really reduce our understanding or change our understanding of young people's behavior to not categorize it as crimes. But unfortunately, what we're seeing now is this decision to make new crimes that are particular to schools. So for example, there have been proposals to create to make it a crime, a misdemeanor, or a felony to threaten mass violence at school. And so that is something that we know has the potential to be overbroad and to be overused, particularly for our young people of color. And then the last thing that is maybe a positive trend is that we are seeing in some places a sort of limited investment in mental health supports. And so some places are, I think, in addition to increasing policing and investment in law enforcement, are also recognizing that there is a need to create some new money for mental health resources in schools to respond to these incidents of school violence. So the first thing that I want to talk about is at the federal legislative level, and that is the Stop School Violence Act. So the Stop School Violence Act was included as part of the omnibus package, and it is something that is in direct response to the Parkland shooting. The Stop School Violence Act has three key parts to know about. One is that there's an anonymous reporting system set up to contact law enforcement about potential threats. The second is that schools are going to be encouraged to create an evidence-based threat assessment mechanism so that when they are dealing with young people in school, that they are assessing students for who might be a threat of an active shooter. And then the last major thing that the bill does is to increase funding to invest in school security through the use of technologies and increase personnel and training of those personnel, including school police. And so I want to talk a little bit about, I think that folks on the ground and folks in the advocacy community are really concerned about this bill and really want to talk about why. So I think that first is that we know that, especially given the data that Kristen shared earlier, that Black students are much more likely to be caught up in the school discipline system despite no differences in behavior. And so with the anonymous reporting system and the threat assessment system, we're really concerned that that young people of color are going to be caught up in those systems unnecessarily and for behavior that they should not be caught up in those systems for. The bill does not set up any kind of due process, any kind of protections against discipline for being being called a threat or being put into an anonymous reporting system. And so we know that this is going to create a system where young people are sort of funneled into these lists of being problem students or threatening students, and yet there's no way to challenge that, there's no way to fight that, and there's really no clear protection for those students from sort of discipline, referral to law enforcement, or arrest for being placed into these systems. And so that's something that we're certainly on the lookout for and certainly really concerned about. I think the other thing that we're of course concerned about is the funding issue. And so there is a huge increase in funding that is going to go through this bill. And we know that turning schools into fortresses is not going to solve mass violence. We don't need right now the appearance of school safety, but we need real solutions that are going to create safe schools. And so what we see happening right now is that money that people have been asking for years for school climate issues, right? Our young people, parents, communities have been advocating at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level for more dollars to be placed into programs like restorative justice, into behavior interventions, into solutions that they know are going to work to really address school safety. And they've been told that there is no money for those things. And then we see that when it is an issue around funding these law enforcement strategies, these arming of school personnel or teachers, that we find this money to do that, and that's something that's really concerning. And we want to make sure that when there are grant programs coming through, that they are opened up to school districts to work with community and to do the things that we know are going to work. So that's sort of a summary of this bill. I think it's something that we are really concerned about. We're going to see the ramifications, and something that we've learned from legislation like this in the past and budgetary allocations like this in the past is that oftentimes this money acts as seed money. So school districts are able to get a limited grant from the federal government or from a state proposal. They adopt that equipment, they hire some personnel, that money goes away, and then school districts decide to maintain those investments and are taking money away from their local budgets in order to do that. And so we know that this isn't just going to be something that exists when this grant program is funded, but that this is going to have ramifications in our schools going forward. I wanted to share a couple of pictures because before the Stop School Violence Act was passed, I had the pleasure of attending a hearing at the Committee on the Education Workforce led by Representative Bobby Scott with Coldane Hayden, who is a young person from Urban Youth Collaborative and Sisters and Brothers United in the Bronx, who's a partner that we at Advancement Project work with and also a grantee of the Communities for Just Schools Fund. And through their support, we're able to have Coldane come down from New York City to attend this hearing and to testify about his experiences in schools and why he really felt that the right solution was not to invest more in law enforcement strategies. And I'm just going to read a quote from Coldane's testimony because I think it's so important to hear that. I am not as technologically advanced as Jamie and was not able to find the video and be able to play it through my screen. So you'll have to excuse the fact that it's in my voice instead of in his. But he says, in an ideal school environment, I would feel safe inside and outside. I would be happy to go into school because I would see people who make me feel comfortable and whom I trust. Instead, I feel caged in, unable to communicate, often feeling like there are a lot of eyes on me. Every day, my first contact with school is a metal detector. We have to line up, take off our belts, sometimes our shoes, and put our bags through the scanner. School police officers yell at us to hurry up and throw our belongings in with no regard for what's inside. It's frustrating that we have to go through all of this just to get into my own school. What is worse is that it is only the students who have to go through the metal detector. What message does that send? That we are the problem, that we are what makes schools unsafe. It is dehumanizing. These words are really powerful and really true. And I think that one of the things that is important to know as we're thinking about these pieces of legislation that are moving through the is that the brunt of these policies and practices are often felt in communities of color and in schools that serve high populations of Black and Brown students. And so despite the fact that the place where we're seeing these incidents of mass violence happen are oftentimes not in communities that are serving high populations of students of color, and despite the fact that it's often not students who are currently enrolled who are perpetuating these crimes, the ramifications and the burden of these pieces of legislation are often placed on Black and Brown students who are currently enrolled. So I want to move next into talking a little bit about some of what's happening at the Department of Education and Department of Justice. And so I was enjoying the summary from the GAO report about all of the great work that the federal government had been doing, and I'm sad to report that a lot of that is not what we're seeing happening right now. So first is that, as many of you know, there is a still standing school discipline guidance package that talks, that really provides guidance to school districts around the country and educators and administrators about not discriminating through the use of school discipline, and that there are requirements that school districts must follow in terms of not discriminating, and those apply to their school discipline policies and practices. We know from lots of different sources that this is something that is likely to be overturned, and something that we're paying attention to and making sure that there's a lot of advocacy around. We want to make sure that the Department of Education and the public knows as a whole that our government should not be removing guidance that is important to tell school districts how to not discriminate. And we want to make sure that we are continuing to protect our students in school. So that's something that we are paying attention to, and that is really intimately connected to the Federal Commission on School Safety that Jamie mentioned earlier, and that we saw the sort of opening of the listening session for. And so the Federal Commission on School Safety was developed in response to Parkland. It is something to look at what is happening at our schools and how to make schools safe. They are supposed to be releasing their findings by the end of the year, and it is an opportunity, I think, to try to influence and to try to understand what those guidance is going to be, and how do we make sure that that guidance is something that really addresses the issues that our young people are facing. We want to also make sure that that School Safety Commission isn't conflating the ideas of school safety and school discipline. We know that those things are not necessarily the same, and that the School Safety Commission should really be focused on what does it take to keep our students safe in school, and how do we do that at the same time that we're protecting the civil rights of young people. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the Department of Education is the Office for Civil Rights Investigations and Dismissals and Case Closures. And this is something that is a flag, something that those of us in the advocacy community are noticing and paying attention to, is that we are seeing a wave of cases being dismissed or closed out that were under active investigation over the past 5 years or longer, and that those cases are now being closed or dismissed with very little resolution, sometimes with no resolution. And so we know that the Office of Civil Rights is not currently acting as an effective enforcement tool for civil rights laws, and that we're seeing that through the dismissal and the closure of these cases. And so really excited for you all to hear later from Miriam and the Education Civil Rights Alliance about alternative strategies that, that we are all developing together to help to make sure that we're protecting the civil rights of young people in schools. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, or the next thing I want to talk about, I guess it's not the last, last in terms of the federal government, is what's happening over at the Department of Justice. And there's a lot happening over at the Department of Justice. I'm going to talk about a very tiny slice as it relates to school safety and school climate and school discipline. So one thing is that the Community-Oriented Policing Office, or the COPS office, is the office within the Department of Justice that funds school resource officers in schools. And they have shifted this, for their current grant cycle, their funding priorities to prioritize police officers who are going to be placed in schools. So COPS as an office funds community-oriented police officers. So those can be police officers that are in the community or that are placed in schools. And so they are shifting to make sure that those police departments that are applying to fund school resource officers are going to have priority funding. And again, we know that this is going to result in an increase in the number of police officers in school, which then in turn results in an increase in the number of young people of color who are arrested in schools. And we know from the data that was presented earlier that that these police are likely to be placed in schools that have a high concentration of Black students, and they're likely to be likely to result in young people seeing an increase in arrests and enforcement activities. The last thing I want to mention is that we're also seeing a defunding of the Comprehensive School Safety Initiative. And so this is one of the initiatives that Kristen mentioned earlier that is funding, that has been over the last number of years, studying school safety and doing a real evidence-based reporting on how do we make schools safe and what does that look like. And that funding is being sort of reallocated to some of, under the Stop School Violence Act, to some of these other pieces that we talked about. And so that's, I think, also concerning, because what we do know from studies that have come out is that all of this investment in law enforcement infrastructure has no evidence in terms of a program or policy that makes schools safe. And so we really do need to be studying and understanding what investments we need to do to make schools more safe. And then last, I just want to do a quick overview, and this will just be 2 seconds, of just what's happening at the state level. I talked a little bit about what some of those trends are, but this is just to get a magnitude of the problem. So this is a sort of pictorial vision of the schools that have proposed legislation to arm teachers or school staff since Parkland. So these are all places where there's a potential of school staff being armed. And so that's something that we're, of course, really concerned about. And then here is a pictorial representation of the states that have proposed legislation to expand school policing and invest more heavily in school policing since Parkland. And so these are the things that we on the ground are felt really keenly and really feel like threats to the great work that we've been able to do. And I think that to the credit of the grassroots organizations and folks that are on the ground, they have been able to push back on a lot of these policies and a lot of these proposals, and really point out the inequities that result from this kind of investment, and encourage their schools and their districts to think about what are the policies that are really going to make students safe. So with that, I will end. I'm just sort of sharing this website because we have a lot of resources on it, and I hope that if folks have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kaitlin. And just so everyone knows, I've been actively using the chat, and a few others are as well. I posted the link to the site that Kaitlin just showed us in the chat box, so it's there if you look for it. And I know we're going to turn to Miriam next. I'm aware of our time, so I'm going to do a couple of quick point of order things right now with great gratitude for all of that rich information. I want to let everyone know, I see we have one phone call person, that we will share all of these slides with you after the briefing today so that you can kind of dig through them at your leisure. I want to actually ask our panelists if they might take one of the two questions I'm about to pose and answer it in the chat box so we can keep things moving. That is specifically the question about if you can share a little bit about the story from each of your unique perspectives of how those new data points that Kristen mentioned were incorporated into the civil rights data collection. So let's take that one to the chat box if you're comfortable with that. I'd like us to answer one question right now. I'm going to let all of you sort out who's the right person to answer this question. And then I'm going to surface two more questions and then turn it to Miriam. We'll answer those last two questions after Miriam's presentation because she will have to leave us a few minutes early today. So with that, the question I wanted to ask is from Donna Marie Wynn, and she asks, is the mental health provider category in the civil rights data collection reserved for those mental health providers who actually have time to support students' mental health? In my humble experience in majority Black schools with few resources, the mental health support staff didn't have much time to provide mental health support. There were too many administrative duties. I really appreciate your question, Donna Marie. It digs beneath the data to the important implementation work that is so often the struggle. It would be great if one panelist wanted to offer a brief response to that before we turn to Miriam.
This is Kaitlin. I'm happy to do it, but if anyone else wants to chime in, please do. You know, I think what that question points to is just really the importance of working with community and with grassroots organizations and with students and parents on the ground, because I think we similarly hear the same types of things, that oftentimes mental health professionals who are assigned to schools, despite the fact that they are psychologists or social workers and they are there to support students in those roles, are oftentimes pulled into test prep or test administration or administrative meetings and don't necessarily have the time to do work that they need to do in order to really support students. I think, and Kristen can correct me if I'm wrong, the data doesn't really sort of dig in, at least the civil rights data collection doesn't dig in to ask folks to describe their duties or to tell us about how that works in practice at their schools. And so I think the data is collected by category of title, but I do think that it just does sort of point to the importance of getting qualitative data about what's happening at our schools in order to have a full picture of what's happening.
Thank you, Kaitlin. That is clearly something we could make the subject of an entire webinar, and I think we should. So stay tuned for that one. And thanks for the great question, Donna Marie. Let me surface those other two questions so the panelists can be thinking about them for the Q&A we'll do after Miriam's presentation. You can check these questions out in the Q&A box, but one is around how to lobby and advocate, right? How to actually, so there's a great question in there, just really about, let me see here. The specific bill folks are watching in California. It's moved through the Assembly. It's now in the Senate. How can folks actually be lobbying and advocating to get it passed? Who to contact and the best ways to approach them? And I pointed Mark, our question poser, to some of the great work that organizations are doing in California that we'd be happy to connect with. And he made a great point about they're working in a suburban context, which is not often included in organizing and advocacy. So Marlyn, when we come to that question, I'm going to turn to you to talk about what that looks like in the context of ESSA and DSC's federal liaison work. And then the second question is another great one. I think we have some really vibrant advocates on the phone with us today. What to do if you're suspicious about how a school district is using funds, how to expose the misuse of funds. So I'll turn to our litigators for that question about FOIAing and other strategies and all the fun things you can do, in addition to getting connected to local groups who are well informed about local context. So with that, knowing that you should all be watching the chat for the vibrant conversation that will unfold there, I'm going to turn it to Miriam to talk with us about the current state of exciting and much needed federal litigation strategies.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And thank you to Damon and to everybody who's involved in this call. These issues are so important, and as was pointed out through both the data and the policy developments, so timely and so important to address right now. So I'm going to stop my video and try and share my screen and see how that works. All right. First of all, just to give you a little introduction, so I'm Miriam Rollin, and I'm with the Education Civil Rights Alliance. New effort, just started 8 months ago. And the Education Civil Rights Alliance is actually convened by the National Center for Youth Law, which started 40 years ago, actually, in the Bay Area as a national backup center for legal services organizations focused on youth issues. So have been doing work for a long time on youth in the juvenile justice system, child welfare system, youth at risk in a variety of ways, and the need to get education services, health services, and other services that these young people are entitled to. So So all students deserve an exceptional education. So that means all students should have great teachers, great curricula, great materials, great school leaders, after school activities, technology, facilities, all of those things that make up an exceptional education. But even if schools have all of those things, there are students who don't benefit from them. And why is that? Well, you've heard quite a bit about that already from the data and from some of the policy developments. That's because students might be subjected to discriminatory suspension and expulsion. They might be subjected to restraints and seclusion in school. They might be arrested or otherwise excluded from the classroom. And you heard again from Kristen the very compelling data in terms of the disproportionality for kids of color on suspension, expulsion, and arrest. And that unfortunately is happening all over the country. Kids are not benefiting also because they're experiencing unlawful obstacles to enrolling in schools or school-related programs because of their immigration status or involvement in the juvenile justice system or involvement in the child welfare system as well. And you heard, I'm sure you're aware that our Secretary of Education recently talked about schools being able to report to ICE the immigration status of families. That is clearly contrary to the law. And she subsequently, when pressed, said, well, maybe I think they shouldn't be doing that. But it was a very half-baked response to an issue that is clear and that schools should play no role in enforcement in immigration issues. Kids also may have barriers to education because they're afraid to go to school. Their district is allowing them to be bullied and harassed, and that might be based on their race, their color, it might be based on their national origin or immigration status, perhaps on a minority religious view, perhaps it's because of sex or sexual orientation or gender identity, and also sometimes because of disability as well. Other students are not benefiting from excellent education opportunities or any educational opportunities because they have unlawful obstacles to accessing facilities that are appropriate to their gender identity, or they have disabilities and they're failing to receive the accommodations and services that they need to benefit from education. And we heard from Kristen about the data of the co-occurrence of disproportionality with regard to kids of color and kids with disability, that each on their own have disproportionalities, but when you look at kids of color with disabilities, the disproportionality rates are through the roof. You also have cases where schools have resource shortages and resource inequities that hinder teachers and administrators in implementing the policies and practices that they need to do in order to remedy these situations. And sadly, as you heard from reports over the last year and a half, the discriminatory barriers to education have been increasing. Now, the good news, if there is any good news, is that federal and state education law establish a foundation of education equity. And that foundation is still there as we speak today. Statutes, constitutions, federal and state constitutions, and also a raft of federal and state statutes protect students' rights to have a safe, supportive, and positive educational environment. And there are landmark federal laws that help support that foundation. We have the Title IV and VI of the Civil Rights Act. We have Title IX of the Education Amendments. We have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, IDEA, et cetera. And that every federal, state, and local education authority is mandated to uphold these equity provisions. Now, as you heard from from Kaitlin's presentation, this foundation is currently under attack, especially at the federal level, but also, as you heard, from a number of state and local proposals as well. So the Education Civil Rights Alliance was launched because of that double threat of increasing attacks on education equity and a substantially weakened federal enforcement approach. Was launched on November 2nd, so about 8 months ago. And the ECRA membership includes actually many of the folks on this call. So it includes powerful state and community groups, such as Legal Aid Justice Center in Virginia, Gwinnett SToPP, and you'll hear from Marlyn Tillman in a moment. It includes the nation's largest teachers unions, NEA and AFT. It includes a variety of accomplished legal and civil rights organizations that do terrific work around the country, the ACLU, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, NAACP-LDF, MALDEF, NICOL, my organization, Lambda Legal, National Women's Law Center, and a host of others, as well as influential national organizations and associations that have extensive experience in addressing educational equity, like the Advancement Project, and you heard from Kaitlin, NBCDI, National Black Child Development Institute, the Committees for Just Schools Fund. So thank you, Jamie. So what is the ECRA doing to address this double threat that I mentioned? Well, there are 5 major strategies that we're pursuing. The first strategy relates to targeted state campaigns. So we have state campaigns that are in, we've selected 10 states to start, and we're doing national state partnerships for in-state work, including taking legal action and addressing inequitable distribution of resources. And that's on a variety of issues, including racial disparities, on discipline and arrests, a whole host of issues that the folks at the state and local level have identified as being their priorities. It's creating state and local partnerships so that folks at the national level have the information about what really are the priorities, where are the biggest problems for kids' educational equity in that state, in that locality. And then the state local organizations have access to these national resources, particularly litigation resources, that can help do some impact litigation and other strategies. The 10 states that we're starting to work in are Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, New Mexico, North Carolina, Oregon, Virginia, Washington, and Wisconsin. So our second strategy, and this has been really interesting, we're creating a state attorneys general national learning community to build the capacity of those state attorneys general offices to strengthen that foundation of education equity. So you heard about federal enforcement work going down. Kaitlin talked about that. You heard about federal guidance being rescinded, or at least at risk of being rescinded in the case of the school discipline guidance from Kaitlin as well. state attorneys general can actually fill some of those gaps. They can issue guidance as to what compliance with the law looks like. They can do enforcement actions, at least many of them. Not all of them have the authority to do that, but many of them have the authority to do enforcement actions around educational equity. And so we've actually had one call in April where we talked about school discipline and school safety, and frankly, the conflation of the two that seems to be going on right now post-Parkland, and some of the research about what actually works to improve behavior and reduce disparate impacts on kids of color and school discipline. We have a second call coming up actually right after this, which is why I have to leave 10 minutes early, to talk about educational barriers for immigrant children and children from immigrant families. That's at 1:30 today. So our third strategy is creating a national learning community of advocates, and particularly focusing on problem solving, strategizing, really trying to figure out what are the legal issues, legal strategies, particularly with a litigation lens, to make sure that we're sharing lessons both across states and between national organizations and state organizations. So our fourth strategy is really an interesting one. So educator engagement. On some of these issues, educators have really been pretty vocal. On others, they have been vocal, but not necessarily always on the side of equity. And so what we're trying to do is build voices of educators who are really committed to education equity and helping to have them educate both their colleagues, other educators, and also the general public and policymakers about the needs and the challenges of marginalized students and the role that teachers can play in positive moves on equity in schools. Our fifth strategy is dissemination of resources. So we're gathering and disseminating and sharing resources to help all of the local stakeholders, parents, youth, advocates, teachers, school administrators, attorneys, help ensure that their communities have safe and supported schools that educate their kids. And we both have publicly available resources on our website, so feel free to visit that. I'll include the web link at the end. And then also ECRA is beginning to develop a members-only platform for sharing some tools that are not for the general public, but are very useful for some particularly legal advocates, like sample pleadings, decisions, etc. I just want to mention that one other strategy that's kind of an overall Uber strategy that's included in all 5 of the strategies that I mentioned is communications. Because part of it is doing the work, but we're never going to be able to bring lawsuits or organize in every single school in every single district across the entire nation where education civil rights are at risk or are being, barriers are being created to those rights. And so what we're hoping is to magnify the great work that all of the member organizations are doing and all of the allied organizations around the country, including the great grassroots organizations that many of you support, and really trying to help elevate that to the general public, to policymakers, so that people understand what marginalized students are really experiencing in schools every day across the nation, and the laws that exist to protect against that, and the fact that actually there's a lot of legal action going on to try and protect those kids' civil rights and address some of those barriers. So I'm very, very happy to have had this time to share some of the information about ECRA. Happy to talk with you individually, and also happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Miriam. I know that you're going to need to leave us in a minute, and I also want to make sure that we leave sufficient time for Marlyn Tillman to share her presentation with us as well, and have time for a few questions. If anybody has a question for Miriam that you would like to get answered urgently, I encourage you to share it in the chat box or in the question and answer box, and we'll try to share that with her quickly before she jumps off of the webinar. But please know that any questions we don't get to, we're happy to include answers in the follow-up materials that we will circulate. I am going to turn to Marlyn, but very briefly, I wanted to just point folks to some of the great answers Kaitlin has put into the chat box in response to a few of the questions around the how-tos of organizing and advocacy. Mark Gaskins, you win the Star Student Award for engagement in the chat box today. I'm looking forward to following up with you. Mark has shared with us panelists, and I'll share it publicly because I think it is something many of us grapple with, the challenges of districts who are operating with an us versus them mentality. And again, I think that I want to highlight the reasons we brought this particular group of experts together. This is a group of folks who understand the need to collaborate across silos in order to ensure that external organizing can be complemented by internal organizing to counter exactly that reality that sometimes it's difficult for people within the government to have or take the courage to work with those who seem to be advancing things that they feel are in counter to what they're already doing. So that actually unintentionally is a wonderful segue, I think, into our presentation from Marlyn Tillman, who has for many, many years now served as an advocate and organizer who got started because of her own personal experiences as a mother in this work and is a real champion for what it means to demand that districts collaborate with parents and students towards the education we aim to ensure is available to all young people. So Marlyn's going to talk about a specific tool today. And with that, Marlyn, we're going to hand it over to you. So feel free to share your screen. It's 1:17. So if I can ask that you try to finish by 1:27 so we have time for a few wrap-up questions, I'd be grateful. And I know you're up to the challenge.
I don't know that I am, Jamie. So thank you for having me and inviting me. And to Mark, I very much understand the us versus them. That is the environment I work in and have worked in now for the last 16 years. And I'm just going to say shame. it works great, shame. But yeah, always dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and seeing where they are. So I'm going to stop my video and share my screen. And let's see, that's what I want to share. Hey, I managed it. So again, Marlyn Tillman, Gwinnett Parent Coalition to Dismantle the School to Prison Pipeline. Gwinnett SToPP for short. We're a parent formed and led organization that works on just what it says, school to prison pipeline, dismantling it in Gwinnett. We're the only parent-led organization focused on this issue in the state of Georgia, so frequently we're working outside of our borders. Well, now I'm not sure how to keep my thing moving. Okay, there we go. So what is ESSA? And I'm going to talk to you about how we can support in this federal work as well as on the local level. So ESSA, or the Elementary Secondary Education Act, is a civil rights law that was originally passed in 1965. It was part of President Johnson's War on Poverty agenda, and it represented the first time that the federal government provided comprehensive education funding to states and districts who that was focused on supporting low-income students. And so in order to receive this funding, states must meet certain requirements. And ESSA, or the Elementary Secondary Education Act, which is what it's always been known as, has now been reauthorized, and it must be reauthorized every so many years. And so this time it's been reauthorized, and they changed it to the new marketing name of ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And through this most recent authorization, ESSA gave districts more flexibility. And the Dignity in Schools campaign, which Jamie asked me to mention about this, which is part of, going to be in my presentation as well, The Dignity in Schools campaign, a national coalition comprised of parent and youth-led organizations, as well as advocacy organizations and policy wonks, we'll say, have come together to do work on the federal level. And so we advocated for a lot of the community pieces that are in ESSA today. And we fought hard for those, for getting parent engagement, youth engagement, getting that seat at the table instead of just being on the menu. And so with that advocacy with DSE as well as other coalitions, AEJ and Journey for Justice as well, you know, we pushed hard to get community engagement in there. But we lost the battle. And they took away the federal oversight. And the feds pretty much kicked the can back down to the local level and said, you all police yourselves. I don't know how that's going to work because that's why the law was formed. They weren't doing what they should have been doing anyway. But what it does do is now make us more aware that we have to be engaged on our state and on our local level around these plans. And so to get the flexibility, they have to engage with community members to make decisions that meet our needs. And so why we're engaging now. So there were so many opportunities built into the ESSA with the coalitions that I mentioned who were lobbying hard, advocating hard for it. So each state must now describe how states will support local school districts in improving school environments for learning. And this includes reducing incidents of bullying and harassment, the overuse of school disciplinary practices that remove students from the classroom, and the use of aversive behavioral interventions that compromise student health and safety. And so ESSA provides all sorts of opportunities to do this with an accountability system. We got our school climate indicator included as an indicator that you can select. It just isn't mandatory. We're still pushing. But states are free to select that. And there were some states that actually took on that challenge to start looking and measuring their school climate. All states must describe how they support districts in improving the learning environment, including the reducing the overuse of exclusionary discipline. So they have to work to decrease the amount of suspensions and expulsions that systems are just using on just things that the kids who may get on their nerves, but really aren't that much of a challenge. But it does make the classroom easier to manage if they put the PIA kit out. And it is so critical now that parents and students and other community members get involved in these decisions that impact their school. One of the first steps in this process of development is the ESSA state plan. And so they've already been developed. Now districts, all of the states have been approved. And so now the districts have to pick up those state plans and fill in the details. And so NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been working with Dignity in Schools campaign hand in hand to ensure that the states meaningfully engage with community stakeholders when they're making these plans around state, when they're making the decisions around state plans. And so in that, they were working in some specific communities, but also supporting the coalition holistically as well. And I want to talk to you about a toolkit that has been rolled out around supporting that local fight. This what used to be a federal fight is now a local fight. And so this toolkit is it was the collaboration of Partners for Each and Every Child, Dignity in Schools campaign, NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. And then we got some other organizations to join in and weigh in on the vetting of this research. So U-Plan kicked in, National PTA joined in. And so we really got what we believe is something very helpful and well-rounded to help the community engage in this local fight. It is our toolkit. So it's the Engage for Education Equity, and it is resources for school communities on what ESSA is and what it means for schools. And so there's a parent supplement, and the parent supplement supports parents with a basic understanding of ESSA, why they should engage, and why it's important for their child, for them to engage. And then they also offer references if you want to get more detailed information. So you read something on the supplement and you want to know, I need more information about that. I may not understand it fully, or I want to know some more about it. It has references of where to go in the full toolkit in order to get that deeper understanding. There's a student supplement that does the same as the parents version, but using a student lens. There's an organizer's packet. And in the organizer's packet, it is a core set of materials for organizers to get started with holding meetings and involving their communities and getting them educated around ESSA. And we define organizers as students, families, community advocates, faith leaders, school staff members, anybody in the school community who is taking this time to gather together school community members to support school improvement. And the toolkit is also complete with sample agendas, PowerPoints, exit surveys. You really don't have to work hard to now organize your community. We've done it for you. We've given you all the tools you need to do this. And so in using the toolkit, we went through a lot of field testing with it. And so we took it around the country and had different organizations look at it, use it, vet it, edit it, and we formally launched it in April. And we think that it will be the best resource out here on the ground that takes in that parent and youth view for learning about ESSA, getting at the table. One of my favorite activities for the toolkit is what does an engaged community look like? And it is a great grounding exercise to help people think about education equity. And then there's the school improvement section, which walks you through that process that every school has to do on a step-by-step basis. So you just pick it up, take a few minutes, get yourself familiar with the toolkit, and then you go on and get your community together.
Marlyn, I know you have 2 slides left. I'm going to suggest you skip to your last one, which is very important for this particular audience. And I've shared the link, which I know is on the one you're on right now.
Yeah, so how can you help? So share this within your network. We also need financial resources to support planning these engagement activities and taking this around the country, doing it in spaces you're in. Translation services so that it's right now it's been translated into Spanish. We need it in other languages. Schools are very diverse. And then there's the engagement opportunities. Just create opportunities for us to come facilitate meetings around this for your constituents, grantees, or networks. And this is only a good tool if it's used. So we really want it shared and used and just really, really used. And it's a living document. So we're always going to have iterations. Send us whatever you think needs to be changed or whatever. Well, we're happy to take that on. And I'm probably over. I guess I am. And I'm done. Thank you.
That was great, Marlyn. You get the gold star for timeliness today. And with that, I want to encourage everyone, first of all, thank you for staying with us for this whole presentation. I hope you see the tapestry of resources and how they, when painted together, show the full picture of how folks are working hard every day to ensure that what is happening here in Washington, D.C., and how it influences what is happening in states and localities around the country, as Damon said in his words at the beginning of this webinar, is really what is needed for young boys and men of color, for their peers in schools around this country, so that we can get to the schools that all children deserve. So again, we'll take a minute to encourage you to just add your questions into the chat so that we can be sure to respond to them offline as we're wrapping up. Please again know that we'll share contact information for all of our amazing presenters, and we'll do our best to respond to your questions. So please don't think of this as the end of the conversation, but I hope just the very beginning. There is a lot of work that lies ahead, and we are incredibly grateful to you for taking the time to join us today and for what it indicates about your interest and commitment to education justice. So with that, a huge thanks to our presenters, and again to all of you for joining us today. More to come from us, and we hope that you head into the weekend with all the hope that today's presentation offers. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Bye.
Thank you.